Today we're going to discuss second dual process theory, the heuristic systematic model. The HSM was actually developed at the same time as the ELM. Indeed, both of these theories were published by PhD candidates in the late 1970s, and both were attempting to struggle with the inconsistent results that were being reported in the attitude change literature at that time, for the past several decades at that time. So the person most closely associated with the HSM is Shelley Chaikin, and she's the one that developed the HSM in her PhD dissertation, and the one that has published most of the articles about the HSM. So just as a reminder, our working definition of persuasion is a subset of social influence whereby a message source attempts to create, reinforce, or change the attitudes, values, beliefs, or behaviors of one or more recipients. And specifically within this literature, we're attempting to figure out how is persuasion possible. Finally, if you remember from last time, we talked about the multiple source message factors that influence persuasion. Basically, when a source is credible, likable, and similar to us, and produces strong arguments that are not too discrepant from what we already believe, we are more likely to be persuaded, and our attitudes are more likely to change. We talked about the ELM last time as well, a theory that posits that whether source or message factors influence persuasion depends on the degree of elaboration likely engaged by the recipient. Elaboration in particular is a function of both the motivation and ability to process the centrally relevant issues or information with respect to a decision. When motivation and ability are high, and thus elaboration is high, there is a high thinking route to change, the central route. It requires more, one or more high thinking mechanisms or processes. But when motivation and ability are low, the elaboration is low, and attitude change is more likely to occur through the peripheral route, which is a low thinking route to change. All the processes within the peripheral route don't require much thought to operate. Also remember last time that one of the main critiques of the ELM is that it seems to suggest that the central and peripheral routes to attitude change are relatively independent, that when one is operative, that the other is not. But we clearly had at least one example with respect to the real estate agent and the buying of the property that suggested there might be some interesting ways in which the credibility of the agent and the information that the agent is providing you might interact, even in the case of you deciding to purchase a property as opposed to just simply trying to select which agent to go with to show you properties. The HSM deals with this, but before we get into the differences, there are a lot of similarities between the HSM and the ELM. First of all, both posit that multiple variables influence persuasion. And as I said at the beginning, Chaikin developed the HSM at a time when the attitude change literature was scattered with respect to whether and to what extent things like credibility mattered to changing attitudes. Her idea was that they do, but only under certain specifiable conditions. And basically that was the premise behind the development of the ELM as well. The second similarity is that both posit two routes to attitude change. The HSM posits the systematic route and the heuristic route. Systematic processing is careful and systematic thinking, similar to the central route or processes that are contained under the central route, whereas the heuristic route or heuristic processing is similar to the peripheral route. This basically suggests that we use cognitive shortcuts when we're making decisions. And the final similarity that we'll touch on here is that motivation and ability are both important to the HSM and the ELM. So the HSM also specifies under conditions of heightened motivation and ability, people are more likely to systematically process the centrally relevant information about a decision. But the theories are definitely important in many respects. So the similarities are sort of illustrated here on this slide. When motivation and ability are high, that's systematic processing, but when one or more of those is low, then heuristic processing is more likely. But again, they do differ in a lot of ways. The first way is that the ELM defines motivation as the motivation to hold correct attitudes. And the HSM recognizes that as a motivation, but also adds two different, qualitatively different types of motivation that are likely operative under conditions of when someone's trying to persuade you. The first is a defense motivation, which is the motivation to defend against an attitude or a position that's consistent with some vested self-interest. So a defense-motivated person tries to preserve his or her views of self. And so the name sort of carries what it means. If I'm motivated in a defense-oriented manner, I'm defending an attitude, and particularly one that's important for my self-image or my view of myself. The second type of motivation the HSM specifies is called impression formation, which is the motivation to hold attitudes that meet immediate social goals, which often includes expressing attitudes that are consistent with socially acceptable positions. The person that's motivated by impression formation strives to make sure that he or she does not express attitudes that others will find offensive or otherwise disagreeable. So the first primary difference between the ELM and HSM, and the HSM is more specific with respect to the different types of motivation that are operative. The second primary difference is that the HSM proposes that systematic and heuristic processing can and often do occur simultaneously. So it addresses that specific critique that we talked about at the end of the last lecture. And the example that we used last time about buying a property and being escorted around to view those properties by a highly credible real estate agent, the ELM would suggest that because you're highly involved in the decision of buying a property, that the credibility of the agent shouldn't influence your decision about which property to buy. Instead, you should evaluate the merits of the arguments that are presented, and you should, basically, depending on what your specific goals are and what your specific concerns are, like whether you need to be close to a coffee shop or a school, that those sort of things are driving your decision where the credibility is not having an influence at all. But the HSM suggests that credibility can influence the decision even under conditions of heightened motivation. That even under the condition of buying a property, which should motivate you to make a good decision, the HSM says that the credibility of the source and other factors like the reliability of information and the attractiveness of the source of the information and so forth can also have an effect even under conditions of heightened motivation. So let's look a bit more closely at the HSM and figure out how those processes can operate together. And we're going to do that by looking at a couple of key assumptions of the HSM. The first key assumption is that humans are motivated tacticians, that we utilize our cognitive energies for important and necessary tasks. Sometimes we act like cognitive misers, spending little cognitive energy on tasks. Other times we act like naive scientists, spending a great deal of cognitive energy on decisional tasks. According to the HSM, our default route, our default mode of processing is the heuristic route. Most of the decisions that we have to make on a daily basis don't take much thinking. How did you get to campus today, for instance? And if I ask you this question, how did you get to campus today, you're likely to answer that question by saying something like, I drove or I took the bus. You're not likely to know all of the exact steps that you took to get to campus. You put the key in the ignition, you stepped on the brake, you put the car in reverse, you backed out of the driveway, you stepped on the brake again, you put the car in drive, you inched forward to the stop sign, turned on your turn signal, took a left at the stop sign, and so forth. And not only are you not likely to remember all of those details, but when you were driving, you're not fully thinking about all these things that you're doing. When you drive or when you do some other task that you're used to doing, you're basically on autopilot. And a lot of the decisions that we have to make in daily life are autopilot decisions. The judgments that we make sometimes are autopilot judgments. If we had to think systematically about all of the decisions, about all of the judgments that we make, we'd be overwhelmed. For the most part, heuristic thinking is adaptive. It helps us to function in a fast-paced world. And so the question then becomes, what makes heuristic processing possible? Why is it that we often do this? So first of all, a heuristic is a quick decision rule that you use when you make some judgment or you make some decision. And the way that these operate is that they have to be available, accessible, and applicable. So in order for a heuristic to operate, it has to first be available. It has to be stored in our knowledge structure. It has to be in our long-term memory. Most heuristics that are studied in persuasion research are socially shared, and so the assumption is that they are available in our memory. Things like credible people are believable, or long messages or strong messages have been shown to be available. In other words, they're socially shared among people, at least in Western cultures. And you may have some specific heuristics that are unique to Korean culture or whatever culture that you are primarily raised in. But in addition to the heuristic being available, it has to also be accessible. That is, it has to be activated in memory. And that's usually done because of the presence of some cue in the environment. In the language of the ELM, it's a peripheral cue. In the language of the HSM, it's basically an environmental stimuli that triggers a decision rule, a heuristic. So a doctor's white coat or a power suit, for instance, are cues in the environment that trigger credibility. Finally, the heuristic also has to be applicable to the decision task. It has to be appropriate to our decision or the judgment that we're making. Even if a heuristic cue comes easily to mind, and even if the person is able to call the heuristic up based on a cue, if the person doesn't believe that the heuristic is relevant, then it won't be used to make the decision. If it's not applicable, it won't be used. Heuristic processing is likely to occur when we are basically sufficiently motivated. Heuristic processing is likely to occur when we're not sufficiently motivated to process all of the relevant information, and we have an available, accessible, and applicable decision cue that's called forth in that situation. But what happens when we are not heuristically processing? In other words, what happens when we're sufficiently motivated? Well, the HSM has a specific answer to this, and it comes in the form of what Chaikin calls the sufficiency principle. According to the HSM, we're kicked out of heuristic default mode when the discrepancy between our actual and desired confidence goes above our individual threshold. All of the variables that the ELM classifies under motivation serve in the HSM to push a person's desired level of confidence higher. For instance, personal relevance should make it more likely that you desire a greater degree of confidence in your decisions. The purchase of a new apartment, for instance, is a big deal. You are spending a bunch of money on this property. So your desired confidence of making a good decision is greater than, for instance, if you're buying a new pair of shoes or a new jacket or a new hat. And so you're motivated to systematically process all of the relevant information on the purchase decision for the apartment, and that's because your sufficiency threshold has been breached to a significant degree. The final assumption of the HSM that we'll discuss is the nature of the interaction between systematic and heuristic processing. According to the HSM, systematic and heuristic processing can act simultaneously. More specifically, the HSM proposes 3 hypotheses that specify how this interaction is likely to occur. The first hypothesis is the additivity hypothesis, which states that when the judgmental implication of heuristic cues and arguments are consistent, heuristic and systematic processing can have independent effects on attitude change. So additivity has to do when there is congruence between the heuristic and systematic processing of a decision. So for example, this ad for Heinz ketchup suggests that their product is natural. No one grows ketchup like Heinz. And the naturalness of Heinz is reinforced by the visual image of the bottle in the shape of a diced or a cut up tomato. The second hypothesis, the attenuation hypothesis, states that in situations where the implications of heuristic and systematic processing are in opposition to each other, the implications derived from systematic processing can overwrite or attenuate the impact of heuristics. But it has to be the case that the recipient is sufficiently motivated to process issue-relevant information. In other words, the desired confidence has to be over the actual confidence. So the person has to be sufficiently motivated to process. And in this case, when there's incongruence between heuristic and systematic processing, systematic can overwrite the heuristic, the impact of a heuristic cue. In a study that was done by Matsawaran and Chaikin, published in 1991, they presented subjects with consensus information that people agree. So toothpaste, 9 out of 10 dentists agree, or whatever the case might be. So they had consensus information that was either congruent or incongruent with the valence of the content of the persuasive message that was presented in conjunction with the cue. For those who were motivated to systematically process, they ignored the consensus information in favor of the arguments. So take McDonald's, for example. One of the many branding techniques of McDonald's is to put the number of people served on their signage outside the building. In the case, the most recent case was billions and billions served. And this, billions and billions served suggests that, there's a type of social proof to McDonald's. So if you take consensus to be important, then you will be persuaded to dine at McDonald's because so many other people have approved of the restaurant. You could pair that consensus information with the billions and billions served with either congruent information like the first message. There's a reason billions of people have loved McDonald's for years. We strive to meet the consumer needs in a way that won't hurt your bottom line. Or you can pair it with incongruent information like the second message. There's a reason billions of people are overweight or obese, and it has to do with the quality of food served at places like McDonald's. If the recipient's highly motivated, then they're more likely to be persuaded by the arguments contained in the message than the consensus information contained in the heuristic. With respect to the second message, the people's attitude toward McDonald's is likely to be more negative after exposure to that message, even with the consensus information provided by the heuristic cue. So the first message is likely to generate an additivity effect. The second message is likely to generate an attenuation effect. The final hypothesis is the bias hypothesis, which states that an ambiguous message can be interpreted in line with a preceding heuristic cue, even if people are highly motivated to process or to engage in systematic processing. So for example, the same ambiguous message can be interpreted differently if the person believes that the message source is reliable than if the person believes the source is unreliable. A second study conducted by Chaikin and Mazararan, published in 1994, presented people with a product description that was supposedly featured in Consumer Reports, which is a reliable source, or in the promotional material for Kmart, an unreliable source. When the description of the product was ambiguous, that is, it was neither definitely strong or definitely weak, the people who were highly motivated and those who were not motivated to process were both influenced by the reliability of the source. So the means weren't different in terms of the attitude, but the underlying processes that generated those means were different. Those who were highly motivated also systematically processed the attributes of the product. and that was found in the description. It was just that their thoughts about the product were colored by the reliability of the source. So in particular, what they found is that when the source was reliable, the participants generated more favorable thoughts about the product, even though they were presented with the exact same product description. The people in the low motivation condition, however, while they were influenced by the reliability of the source, their thought listing data did not differ as a function of the product information. So both the HSM and the ELM suggest interesting ways in which we're influenced by things that we may not realize. The images we see, the implicit messages that we receive, all can influence our decisions, from the clothes we wear, to the food we buy, to the things we eat, to the things we do. Sometimes we think a lot about our decisions. Sometimes we make decisions rather hastily. Although heuristic thinking is not all bad, when it comes to some aspects of our lives, we should stop and think about the judgments that we make.